So let me just contrast two positions. So I'm based in Tokyo. So let me talk about Tokyo's geopolitical narratives. I'd like to bring in China's geopolitical narratives. And then maybe as a Canadian, I'll bring in those three narratives, because I think our narratives about our geopolitical situations are very much related to our past, to our neighbors, and really to the resources that we have. Now, if we think about Japan's past, Japan was an island state. They sometimes call it the sakoku, right? It was a closed state for many hundreds of years, and the kind of engagement it had with the outside was limited through small trading posts in Nagasaki. It became a modernized so-called Western power. It became an imperial power, and that imperial power ended in defeat at the hands of the United States. So today's Japan's geopolitical narrative is very much based on its strategic orientation, which is as a maritime state. It's based on its interpretation of the past of being the only country that has been victims or has been bombed by nuclear weapons, and it created a pacifist constitution that limits how it engages within the region. So when Japan is thinking about its own geopolitical narrative, it's generally thinking about it through the lens of pacifism, through defense, and how it can maintain an international order based on rule of law, such that rules, not a Machiavellian might of right approach, is the lens by which we engage in international affairs. That's the Japanese experience. But if we pivot to its neighbor, China, China's current geopolitical narrative and how it understands security issues are very much related to its own domestic insecurities associated with governance, but also its historical experience where imperial powers invaded and cut up China. They sometimes use the expression cutting up the watermelon following the Opium Wars, really up until Japan's invasion in 1931, all the way up to the end of 1945. So its geopolitical narratives are really focused on this idea that its external environment is a threat. Its external environment in the past has been something that has led to weakness, and this weakness led to what the Chinese sometimes call is 100 years of humiliation. In that context, the current government in China has created a government and a system of security that really is focused on preventing that history from reasserting itself. So in a John Mishemer kind of vision, maximizing its power in its periphery to ensure that that past never repeats itself. And it plays out in terms of its external investments in its military buildup, which is quite significant, about 10% year on year in terms of military spending increases. We see a large naval expansion trying to prevent those outside forces from, again, splitting China domestically. And we also see a huge focus on domestic security investments to prevent the state from becoming weak, and that centralized control that has been even more centralized under Xi Jinping from dominating the situation. So China's past has created a geopolitical narrative in which it must strengthen itself and maximize power in its external environment, and arguably dominate its periphery. And that means kicking out the United States and the United States-based security architecture, dominating the South China Sea, which comes at the expense of the Philippines and Vietnam and all the Southeast Asian states, as well as rebooting or rethinking international institutions so that those international institutions don't work in the favor of rule of law and transparency and democratic principles. Rather, they preserve the primacy of the domestic political system within the Chinese context. The third example is Canada, where I'm from. And Canada has a long and generally peaceful history. It has very strong relations with its southern neighbor, the United States. I think the last time we had a real conflict outside the domain of ice hockey really was back in 1812, when the Canadians invaded and burnt down the White House. Our relations are very deep. We share political values, cultural values, language, and an inclination towards Europe, but also increasingly trade and security interests in the Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. So Canada's never been invaded, so it doesn't have the experience of the Chinese. It's never been an imperial power in the same way that the Japanese have. And as a result, its geopolitical narrative is very much wedded to supporting international institutions, creating and supporting an international order based on rule of law, cooperating in multilateral institutions, and whether it is a conservative or a liberal government in the Canadian context, is really trying to contribute to public good provision globally. So Canada's, again, geopolitical narrative is very much wedded to its past history of having strong relations with Europe, its strong and peaceful relationship with the United States and in North America in general, and contributing to the post-World War II international order in terms of international institutions such as the G7 or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So it's very much, I think, a status quo power. And as it thinks about the challenges that we're facing today, I think the challenges of authoritarian states breaking down our international institutions. For Canada, this is a real threat. It threatens its post-World War II prosperity, the institutions it's contributed to. In the context of Japan, I think similarly, it threatens the institutions that have been arguably essential to Japan's peaceful and prosperous post-World War II development. But in contrast to that, I think China looks at the current international order as inherently unfair and unrepresentative of Chinese post-World War II interests, interests that have been propagated by, from their point of view, Western powers in an unequal way. So it's these contrasting geopolitical narratives that are interesting to think about, but again, they're based on geography, their experience with their past, and how they understand their security challenges today. I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists. Thank you.